All right. So, my name is Jack McTasney. I'm the electrical captain. And this presentation is going to be about the tools and materials used by the electrical team. Next slide. So, here we have one of the main materials that electrical uses, wires. Wires come in many different sizes. We've got, hold on, to begin with. So, how the gauging system works is the higher the number of the gauge, the smaller the wire. You can see with this chart here. 12 is around 2 millimeters, then you go down to 22 and it's only 0.6. These smaller 22 gauge wires would be used for like tiny things like on yesterday's presentation, there was the Robo Rio with the really small pins. Very small 22 gauge wires would be used for things like that, where you could put multiple in a brick together and then put them into one of those sockets. The larger 12 gauge wires are used more with motor controllers, motors, connecting the different boards together, like the VRM and the PDP, stuff like that. All right, next slide. Here we've got wire strippers. These strip the insulation coating off of the wires to expose the copper part, like you saw in the last slide, how part of the copper is exposed, the rest of it is just that rubbery silicon type stuff. The stripper to the left is more of a manual one, where you put the wire into one of those circle slots, you spin it around a bit, and you pull it off yourself. The one to the right is almost completely automatic. You just put the wire in between those two parts, you squeeze, and it takes the insulation off all by itself. You don't really have to do much work. All right, next slide. Here we've got utility razors. We use these more for the big wires that we can't use those wire strippers for because their gauge is just so huge that they don't fit in them. Obviously, when we do stuff like this, we're wearing protective gloves and we're making sure that there's no one around us. So if the knife slips, we're not going to cut ourselves or anyone else. We've got a few different kinds in the club. I'm pretty sure we have a few of these flipping ones, like the picture in the middle. And the ones all the way to the right are just you push that little top button down and slide it out to expose the razor. Next slide. Here we've got wire cutters. Pretty self-explanatory. These cut the wires. The two to the left are used for the more small gauge wires, and the one all the way to the right is the really, really heavy duty one that we use for the big wires that have a ton of copper in the middle, or we can use them for anything that's being stubborn and won't cut with the other two. Next slide. Here we have small gauge wire crimpers. So now we're going to start getting into the stuff that not many of you have probably heard about. To the top left, we have my personal favorite kind of crimper. This is the one that does pretty much everything for you, where you put the exposed part of the wire, like you can see in the bottom middle. That's what the wire should look like before it goes into the crimp, with the metal part kind of folded back over the insulative thing. And then the picture all the way to the bottom left, you stick that wire into one of those, into the really big circular part, or not the really big circular part on the end, but the part that you're going to press down with the tool. And then you put it inside the tool, you press down, it'll smush the connector and the wire together. So it'll hold itself in place just by that huge amount of pressure. There's also the top right tool that we use sometimes. Those are a lot cheaper, and we have a lot more of them because they come with sets of crimps. The crimps are the tiny parts that you put on the end of the wires. So I don't really like using those. They hurt your hands a lot when you use them, and they're really not ideal. To the bottom right, you can see a Spark motor controller with two wires crimped into crimps screwed in. That's like a practical application of what we would actually use them for in the club and what they would look like on the robot. All right, next slide. Now we have the large gauge wire crimper and the crimp that we use for that. To the left, you can see the big, people that have seen these in person can tell you these things when compared to the small gauge wire crimper, these are huge. Like it is giant in comparison. And it's meant to crimp these big, like 4 and 6 gauge wires that are just absolutely giant. You can see in all the way to the right how big the wire is in comparison to that person's hand. Then in the middle, we've got a picture of the actual crimp itself. These are called They're called a bunch of different. I just like to call them crimps just because they are, and you can just classify everything under that one category. Some people call them lugs. It's whatever. But yeah, the main point is these are huge. They require this huge crimper to get them down. Main slide or next slide. These are ferrule crimpers and ferrules. We didn't actually know about these in the club until 2 or 3 years in. So you take these ferrules, they're the picture in the top right, you stick a wire into them. So you're going to have some of that exposed connection and some of the insulation in that metal part, and then the rest of the wire sticking out of the plastic part. And then you stick it into the tool shown on the left and squeeze it to close that big metal hole, and it'll crimp it to look like that little green one inside the tool picture. And then we take these ferrules and we would put them into things like the PDP shown all the way to the bottom right. So it'll fit right in that hole and it'll stay a lot better than just the raw wire itself uncrimped with anything. Next slide. Now we have a soldering iron and solder. Just a word of caution, if you are not in the electrical team, you are expressly not allowed to use these unless you have a direct order from someone else to use it or permission to use it, because these are very hot. First of all, they can heat up to hundreds of degrees almost instantly, and they're very dangerous if you don't know how to properly use them. So how the soldering iron works, we have these temperature controlled soldering stations. So you can, with that little dial on the big tool, you can spin that and change what temperature you want to heat it up to. It'll heat up this almost metal pencil or pen looking thing towards the bottom of the photo to hundreds of degrees Celsius. And then that metal pencil will melt the solder. Solder is shown in a spool to the top right. And you can do a bunch of things with that solder. You can use it as shown to the bottom right, uh, to solder wires to things like that potentiometer. I know we don't really like using potentiometers, but this is just a good example of things that I've done personally. So that'll join the wire and those metal tabs almost permanently unless you pull on them super, super hard or you heat them up to a really high degree. And it's very good at doing that. It's real only purpose. Next slide.
It's metal glue.
Yes, it's like welding on a smaller scale, if you want to think of it like that. Now we have the solder gun. It's all the same principles of the soldering iron, but you can heat it up a lot hotter, a lot faster, and you have a bigger area to work with. So this is used to melt huge gauge solder, like what's shown to the right. You can see that's a lot thicker than the solder that was in the last slide, to fuse wires together. So go to the next slide. This is just a quick diagram of how we would fuse said wires together. Pretty much you just take the two wires, you twist them together. This person's using a soldering iron. I personally don't like using a soldering iron for this because it's much easier to use the gun. But it's the same premise. You would take the gun, you would meet it with the solder at the wire point there, and you would just kind of melt the solder all over it, and it'll evenly spread among the metal. And then you're just going to get one solid wire connection that won't come apart pretty much no matter what you do to it unless you chop it in half. Next slide. Now we've got the respirator and safety. So the respirator, shown to the top right, we use those when we're soldering because we don't want to breathe in those particles from the melted solder. Those are not very good for your health, obviously. Melted metal is not good. Melted lead is even worse. But, all right, so now we've got some safety things. We want to use the respirator properly as like, so you can see with the respirator, there's those two pink pads. Those screw on in a certain way. We want to make sure that they're always screwed on the right way and they're not loose. Because if they're loose, it loses its effect and won't do anything to help you. We want to keep our eyes on the hot tools at all times. Things like the soldering iron, there's a heat gun, anything like that. You don't want to lose sight of those and you don't want to put them anywhere where someone can't see them. Like you don't want to put them on the floor. in a corner somewhere where someone could be searching for something and just touch it because it'll burn their hands, and you can get up to third-degree burns from these things almost instantly because of how hot they are. You want to make sure that you're putting soldering iron back in its stand when you're done, and all the solder and heat guns in a safe, clearly visible place. Those don't really have their own stands, but they're so big that if you just put them on a table where they're easily visible to cool down, that's okay. Don't Please don't put anything hot or sharp on a chair. Nobody's gonna have a fun time. It's just not a good idea. Please don't do it. Just put it on a table or somewhere where it's clearly visible. Don't leave anything like the soldering iron plugged in and then walk away from it. If that thing somehow manages to fall out of its stand when it's heated up to 600 degrees and it goes on a wooden table, we can all think of what's going to happen from that. We don't want that to happen. We don't want to put any of the self-heating tools like the soldering iron or the heat guns near anything flammable like WD-40 or compressed air cans, because if like the can somehow manages to fall on something super hot and the super hot thing comes in contact with gas or flammable liquid, that's not good. We don't want that to happen. You don't want to leave any kind of water bottles or any open liquid near live wires or self-heating tools. I don't feel like I need to explain this. Just please don't leave liquids in a workspace, especially one where electrical is working. All right, that's it for our tools and materials.